In the race for superpower dominance, resources and influence are the currencies worth accumulating. And this is something that China has been doing for years in a continent many in the West seem to have forgotten about. I am, of course, talking about Africa, home to some of the largest deposits of natural resources in the world. A continent that contains 65% of the world's arable land. A continent that by 2050 will have a quarter of the world's population. Today, I'm going to tell you exactly what China has been up to in Africa and what it could mean for the balance of global power. Before we dive into China's strategy in Africa, it's important to appreciate how important the continent will be in the next few decades. As I mentioned, it's a vast and largely untapped resource for all types of minerals and commodities. Everything from copper to cobalt, gold to diamonds, and aluminium to titanium. For example, according to estimates from the United Nations, Africa is home to 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 40% of the gold, 12% of its oil, and 90% of its chromium and platinum. This map over here is pretty handy and it shows exactly how resource-rich Africa is. It's colour-coded by those countries with the most abundant minerals. All of these resources are important for any country that is looking to continue growing economically. They're even more important at a time when older mines are starting to become exhausted and older wells are running empty. What's perhaps most surprising about this is the fact that Africa only accounted for about 5.5% of the world's total mined minerals in 2019. Those deposits are sitting there waiting to be extracted. And it's not only the mineral wealth that much of Africa is sitting on. Those vast tracts of arable land mean that the continent could become a breadbasket for the world. This is particularly relevant now when you realize how dependent we've become on farmland in regions such as Ukraine and Russia. And finally, we also have to consider Africa's human capital potential. The continent has the fastest growing population in the world. Sub-Saharan Africa's population is expected to double by 2050. This is important because of the fact that population decline is one of the biggest threats the world faces. It's something that Elon Musk is most concerned about, and it's the subject of a video I did recently. That is in the description for you. The point is that countries cannot continue to grow economically if they have declining populations. Hence, as Africa is going to have plenty of new, young people entering the workforce in the coming decades, it can continue its rapid economic growth. By some estimates, Africa is well on its way to becoming a $5 trillion economy as household consumption is expected to increase at a 3.8% yearly clip. This growing population also presents economic advantages for key trading partners. All of these African citizens will be important consumers of products and services and hence will offer strong export demand for countries that have tapped out Western markets. Not only that, but all these people could be potential allies or adversaries based on how they view other countries. In a game of international influence, the more people and countries that you have on your side, the more geopolitical clout you have. So it's quite clear that there are a number of reasons why Africa is a continent which cannot be ignored. And China is now involved in a modern-day, quote, scramble for Africa. Take a look at this chart over here. This is the total amount of FDI, or foreign direct investment, that China has been sending to Africa over the past 17 years. As you can see, it has gone from a mere $74 million in 2003 to over $45 billion in 2018, although it shrunk slightly during COVID. All of this makes China Africa's fourth largest investor and places it ahead of the United States in this regard. Not only that, but Chinese loans to African countries have totaled $153 billion between 2000 and 2019. More about that in a bit. The vast majority of this investment in and loans to Africa has gone into the development of infrastructure. This is all part of China's so-called Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. For those unfamiliar, this is a global infrastructure initiative unveiled by the Chinese government in 2013. It forms the centerpiece of Xi Jinping's foreign policy and calls for China to play a greater role in world diplomacy. Essentially, it's a strategy to win the hearts and minds of foreign populations. Of course, this is all infrastructure that the Chinese could also eventually use themselves. Now, as of August 2019, 149 countries were listed as having signed up to the BRI. Chinese investments in infrastructure for African countries have been particularly outsized, however. For example, according to this report, in 2018, China provided over 25% of the overall funding contributed towards infrastructure development projects in Africa. And in this 2017 McKinsey report, Chinese firms and construction companies won almost half of all engineering and procurement projects continent-wide. However, while China has been ramping up its infrastructure development on the continent under Xi, it's not in fact a new phenomenon. That's because China first entered Africa back in the 1970s, and one of its first projects was a railway that connected ports in Tanzania to towns in Zambia. This was done under the leadership of Chairman Mao, and it was the most expensive infrastructure project that China had ever attempted. It was also a godsend to Zambia, which was effectively cut off from seaports further south thanks to the actions of the Zimbabwean government. With this new railway, Zambia could export its copper to world markets, including, coincidentally enough, a fast-growing China. I'll leave a link to the story about the Tazara Railroad in the description for you. It is truly fascinating. Now, of course, infrastructure developments like this and many subsequent ones mean that China has strong ties with politicians and business leaders in the African countries it is being built in. This means that they can enter into mutually beneficial trade agreements which shake up the status quo. According to data from China's customs agency, trade between China and Africa rose to its highest level last year. It increased by 35% from 2020 to $254 billion last year. You can see what that looks like here. Not only that, but China looks set to overtake the EU as Africa's biggest trading partner by 2030. This will be a symbolic moment, given that many European nations are viewed by many in Africa as the colonizers of yesteryear, now being overtaken by new colonizers, so to speak. What do I mean by that? Well, it all really depends on the terms that China has attached to much of its infrastructure spending. While FDI is great, loans for bridges ain't, and Africa has been racking up quite a number of loans over the past few years. If you take a look at this infographic here, you can see those countries that are most in debt to China. African ones stick out like a sore thumb. Those countries with the highest debt loads were Djibouti and Angola, where the aggregate Chinese debt exceeded 40% of their gross national income. In the case of Djibouti, China holds 70% of its total debt. According to the World Bank and the IMF, these loans are structured more like commercial loans, and they have shorter repayment windows. Their conditions are also confidential, and they're usually used for the purpose of building infrastructure rather than broader humanitarian goals. Now, of course, I would argue that the IMF and World Bank don't exactly have much right to opine on the matter, but perhaps that's just me. Either way, the point is that when someone owes you money, you have a great deal of sway over them. That's why people have accused China of engaging in what is termed, quote, debt trap diplomacy. Essentially, if you owe China money, you're more likely to dance to its tune, not only when it comes to concessions within your own country, but also on the international stage. For the clearest example of this, you only need to look at how countries in Africa tend to vote on UN resolutions. For example, in 2020, 50 countries issued a statement supporting China's crackdown in Hong Kong. More than half were African. Some African countries have also been silent on China's human rights record in places like Xinjiang. The president of Burkina Faso has stated, quote, Some Western forces hyping up the so-called Xinjiang-related issues are actually launching unprovoked attacks on China to serve their own ulterior motives. That same meeting was attended by the presidents of Sudan and the Republic of the Congo. Or, if you want to take a look at a much more sensitive issue with China, you can see how support for Taiwan has almost completely evaporated across Africa. This wasn't always the case. Back in the 1960s, Taiwan outpaced China in its efforts to cement diplomatic ties with African nations. However, ever since a 1971 vote that denied Taiwan a seat at the UN table, African countries have been switching their allegiances. In 2018, Burkina Faso officially cut ties with Taiwan, and now there is only one African country that retains ties with the island. That's the Kingdom of Eswatini, one which has been underrepresented in Chinese investments and wasn't invited to numerous Africa-China summits. It does make me wonder how long they can hold out. The point is that China knows that these investments, as well as debts, give it a great deal of clout with these countries. But what happens if a country finds itself in a position where it can no longer service its debts? Well, like any hard-up individual debtor, it could lose some of its collateral. Up until a few years ago, the notion that a nation-state would seize another country's key infrastructure over a bad debt was laughable. However, this happened a few years ago when China took over the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. This was a port built by the Chinese with debt financed by Chinese banks. When Sri Lanka struggled to repay its debt, it was forced to hand over the port on a 99-year lease. More about Sri Lanka's economic woes in the description. So, given Sri Lanka's experience with bad Chinese debt, African countries are naturally beginning to worry too. You only need to take a look at the number of Chinese-built ports around the world and where they are concentrated. The alarm over this was raised 3 years ago in Kenya, for example, by the country's Auditor General. He said that Kenya could be made to surrender control of its port in Mombasa if it defaulted on a $3.6 billion loan from China used to build a railway. It's not just ports either. Quite recently, there were concerns that China may attempt to grab Uganda's Seoul International Airport. This was due to the fact that China had extended a $200 million loan to expand the facilities there. A parliamentary probe in Uganda concluded that China had imposed onerous conditions on the loan, including potential forfeiture of the airport in case of default. The Ugandan finance minister was hauled before Parliament and grilled about the loan. He apologised profusely and said, "We shouldn't have accepted some of the clauses, but they told us you either take it or leave it." Whether that is indeed the case is hard to tell. The Chinese, for their part, have adamantly denied the claim that they were attempting to seize the airport. Moreover, the concerns that were raised about the Mombasa port appeared to be as a result of a misunderstanding over a key clause in the contract. And, as of yet, China still hasn't seized any African infrastructure. However, concerns do remain. Now, remember that chart I showed you about how indebted Djibouti was to China? Well, it turns out that China has been investing heavily in the country. This has been happening ever since China's People's Liberation Army, or PLA, established its first and only overseas military base. China is said to have spent $590 million on both this military facility and the Douala multi-purpose port, the deepest port in East Africa. The port is also of great strategic importance given its location. It sits on the Horn of Africa and near key shipping routes. More recently, a Chinese company agreed to finance Djibouti's port revamp in a $350 million investment deal. The company already owned 23.5% of the port, so this could be a further ploy to embed its influence. Given the parallels that this shares with the Sri Lankan port prior to its seizure, you have to worry. Let's also not forget that military base near the port, one that the Chinese seem dead set on keeping in place. Either way, the prospect of infrastructure seizures or more onerous concessions will always dog those African countries that have taken on Chinese debt. Okay, so that's a concern that many have with Chinese engagement in Africa. But what do Africans themselves think of this? And are these characterizations by the Western media fair? Most Africans view China in a positive light. For example, a survey last year of 34 African countries by Afrobarometer, a research group, found that 63% of the respondents thought China had a very or somewhat positive influence. The US, meanwhile, only scored 60%. Quite surprisingly, the African Union has a lower rating than both countries. The Economist magazine also conducted a similar survey earlier this year where the majority of the respondents thought China had a good rather than a bad influence. And in another survey by the Ichikowicz Family Foundation, the vast majority of African youth see China as the most influential player on the continent. This survey targeted 4,500 younger Africans between the ages of 18 and 24. It's also important to note that US influence in the minds of these citizens has also dropped over the years. China's impact on the continent was also seen as more positive than that of the US. According to the survey's authors, quote, "Young Africans are telling us that they are seeing tangible, visible, and very impactful signs of the role that China has played in the development of Africa." This is all quite telling. It shows that, despite the concerns in the Western media about China's intentions in Africa, African people themselves still view China as a friend rather than a foe. That is interesting in itself, but it also shows that mistrust of the West runs deep in Africa. China is definitely not making these investments for charitable purposes, but as long as local citizens see some of the returns from said investments, it's an improvement on the status quo. So what if China is funding the construction of an airport or a road? It's better, surely, than not having them at all. Let's also not forget that the IMF and World Bank have a really shoddy record when it comes to growth and development. I talked about this in my video on the IMF, which I'll leave in the description for you. Moreover, I happen to think that the often patronizing way in which Western governments, media, and other organizations portray Africa could play a factor in these surveys. Africa is sometimes made out to be a somewhat hapless place that's unwittingly being taken advantage of by ruthless foreign governments, an image that many Africans doubtless take issue with. African leaders also want to make it clear to Western governments that they have no option but to deal with China on account of the lack of engagement from the West, and they have a point. Despite this, though, it's encouraging to see that many Africans do also have a healthy dose of skepticism when it comes to China. According to that aforementioned Afrobarometer survey, the majority of the respondents are concerned about being heavily indebted to China and say that their governments have borrowed too much money. The respondents also think that China's influence is on the decline. The proportion of Africans who said China's economic activities in their countries have some or a lot of influence on their economies has declined over the past 5 years, from 71% to 59%. But if China continues to be viewed more favorably by Africans than the West, then it will be well positioned to take advantage of a continent that is poised to become a global powerhouse in a few decades' time. Okay, time for a few of my thoughts on China's scramble for Africa. It's quite clear that Africa is going to become one of the most important, if not the most important continent in the not-too-distant future. Therefore, it makes logical sense for China to be positioning itself to make the most of the opportunities there. China cannot continue to power its economic engine unless it has the resources to buy goods as well as the buyers to consume them. It also needs to curry favour with countries around the world, especially at a time when it's vying for allies against Taiwan. And its initiatives on the continent have had a great deal of success. This is reflected in the growth of Chinese trade and the favourable perceptions the citizens of Africa have of China's influence. However, practices that threaten to entrap countries into debts they cannot pay back threaten to stain that reputation. This is something that China seems to have appreciated more recently, and it has in fact forgiven the debt of a number of African countries. I also think that African countries have a healthy skepticism about these loans and Chinese involvement more generally. From the era of European colonialism to the IMF, World Bank and USSR in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, they know that other countries have long been eager to feed at their trough. But if they're able to craft deals and agreements with the Chinese that give them infrastructure and trade that they wouldn't have with the West, then they are in a strong position. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. And for the West's part, it should also try and engage more with Africa. But it shouldn't be with the same playbook that many Western countries used in the past. Moreover, viewing Africa as a victim of exploitation isn't flattering, and trying to present yourself as the white knight who can save it is insulting. Quite simply, global superpowers should treat Africa as they would like to be treated. They should show its leaders respect on the world stage and foster mutually beneficial relationships that can take advantage of its growth. It could be an investment that pays off handsomely in 30 years' time. And that's it for my video today, folks. But what are your views? What do you think of Chinese involvement in Africa? I would love to know down below. If you don't have a comment, that's cool. But you may be interested in my socials page, however. This is the page where I share exclusive content that you are not getting here. It has links to my Telegram, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, the whole shebang. Oh, and don't forget my weekly newsletter, because it's here where I share my crypto tips as well as a breakdown of my personal portfolio. It comes only once weekly, as well as with a spam-free guarantee. And if you want some epic crypto merch, then you have to check out my merch store. Hoodies, beanies, tees, it's the bee's knees. Finally, if you found this video helpful, slap a like on it. Subscribe and ping that bell as well to make sure you never miss another one. Time's up for this guy, but I'll be seeing you guys very soon. Till then, kwaheri and take care of yourselves.